Hi guys, and welcome to the second part of my November reads. I had originally meant to do this wrap-up in 3 parts because November was quite a big procrastination month for me, so I read quite a few books, in addition to the 4 German books that I have already talked about. I read 5 books from the science fiction and fantasy genres, but also 4 others of different genres, different from SFF and different from each other. And I was going to talk about them in a separate video, but I have since thought better of it, because there is one book among those 4, one novella, that I thought I'd like to make an extra review video of, just to give it some exposure. But I don't want to lump the remaining 3 books in with the SFF books, because that would make for an overly long and muddled video. But I don't actually have that much to say about the new Asterix anyway. It was fun, it was cute, it will never be a classic of the series. And I am only too happy to not talk about the Sellout by Beatty. I enjoyed it, I laughed a lot, I thought the author is absolutely brilliant, so brilliant that it was humbling to read him. But this book is very hard to talk about because its humor is so complicated and of so many different varieties, and I'm afraid I'm just not invested enough right now to put in the effort that the book needs for even just a short review. So suffice it to say that I thought it was brilliant, and I'm glad that this brilliant author was rewarded with a Booker Prize for this book. So there's just one book that remains, and that's Mountains of the Mind by Robert Macfarlane. And I'll just talk about this book once I've read a couple other non-fiction books and can wrap them up in a video together, hopefully at the beginning of the next year. Hopefully together with Underland by Robert Macfarlane. So on to the science fiction and fantasy books. By the way, there is construction work going on outside. I might or might not be able to edit it out. In case I'm not, I'm sorry for the inconvenience. But anyway, fantasy. Let's start with a good one, because there were some duds. I read my first Patricia McKillip book in November, The Bell at Sealey Head, which might also be her most recent one. It was first published in 2008. This is a delightful little fantasy tale that is very modest in scope, and all the more enjoyable for it. It is set in an unnamed country that looks and feels a lot like George in England, and the story takes place in the sleepy seaside town of Sealey Head, where a bell rings every day at precisely the moment the sun sets. It has been doing that for hundreds of years, and most people can't even hear it anymore. Or when asked about it directly, they will put it down to maybe some ghost pirate ship that sunk in the harbor, and then they'll forget about it once again. Except for a handful of young people who have been wondering, but who haven't exactly been very proactive about lifting the secret. But that all changes when a young scholar arrives in town, and he is going to get to the bottom of the secret, and he's going to enlist the help of the young people in town. This was an utter delight to read. It is full of atmospheric magic of a non-fleshy kind that fits the small town setting perfectly. It's just altogether so nice, and for once I don't mean nice as an insult. It's just utterly charming. It captures the tone and feel of a Jane Austen novel without trying to imitate the style exactly and embarrassing itself while doing so. It is also full of the quiet and good-hearted humor of a Jane Austen novel, and it is also subtly satirical and makes fun of customs and traditions that are followed blindly and mindlessly by people just because things have always been this way, and it makes fun of how people often don't question the underlying principles of a societal reality anymore, once it's been a reality long enough. I enjoyed that a lot, and I can't wait to read more by Patricia McKillip. I have a small collection now. Not quite as good a read was Magic's Pawn by Mercedes Lackey. This is the first book in the last Herald Mage trilogy, which is part of the larger world of Mercedes Lackey's Valdemar books. It was published in 1989, Magic's Pawn, that is. I expected this to be a total comfort read, just solid classic epic fantasy, but it was so bad. It was cliched in the extreme, melodramatic in the extreme. The story is this. There is this misunderstood Fey boy from this backwater town who gets sent to the Queen's court in order to be straightened out in every respect by his aunt, who is one of the Queen's mages. And there at the court, of course, he finds love as well as his true destiny and purpose. And that's about the end of the complexity of this story. Really, the only things that were in any way surprising were A, the level of the melodrama, which was through the roof of a 100-floor building, and B, how nothing whatsoever about the world that the book is set in is explained to the reader. I know that the book takes place in a world that was already established in earlier books, but it is its own trilogy, its own spin-off thing, so I would have expected the author to give the reader some kind of guidance into this world. But in all honesty, I don't even remember the name of the country, the kingdom that the story is set in, having been mentioned in the book. I assume it is Valdemar, but Valdemar might as well be the whole world, and I just don't know the name of the country. I really don't remember it being mentioned in the book. And I don't know who that queen is, and if I'm supposed to like her or not. I don't know what this group of mages are doing at the court, how many there are, and what their position or their function is. I know nothing whatsoever. So that was super frustrating, and I can't see an author getting away with something like that in a spin-off trilogy that was published nowadays. All in all, I don't know, this is a super popular book and it has gotten some rave reviews. So I've been wondering if maybe it is a case of a book, a fantasy that hasn't aged very well. But in all honesty, I don't see how this book could be called good by the standards of any time. I'm sorry, it's just a complete mystery to me. And then I picked up something that I don't usually gravitate towards, and that is military SF. In this case, The Light Brigade by Kameron Hurley. This title is, of course, a pun on the military category, military term, light infantry, light cavalry, etc. And it was this title that first drew me to the book. So, story time. I have always, for, 15, 20 years, been aware of the existence of Tennyson's poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. However, for the longest time, I knew next to nothing about the Crimean War, and while I am reasonably well versed when it comes to the terminology of the British Navy, the land army is largely obscure to me. So when I heard the title of the poem, and for years and years after, I was under the impression that it was something similar in content to The Hosting of the She by William Butler Yeats. I understood light to mean not the opposite of heavy, but the opposite of darkness. And from there, it was only a small step to elves and fairies, because they are always riding through the forest with their lanterns, aren't they? So a light brigade would obviously be part of an army of elves. I still like this version better than the Crimean War thing, to be honest. But back to the book. This takes place in a post-apocalyptic future in which climate disaster and war have made large parts of the planet uninhabitable and contaminated, and the soil is barren, especially in the global north, ironically enough. Countries have vanished and the world is divided into the territories belonging to a handful of corporations who have become territorial rulers. So, a disturbing vision of late-stage capitalism. The society is strictly hierarchical, with only a very small exclusive group of citizens accorded full human rights and given access to vital resources like healthcare or just nourishing food. And the majority of people are either residents, so one step below citizens with not as much access, or just scum living in the slums outside the cities and exploited for cheap labor or free labor. But all people are united in the fight against the evil splitter group who have taken up residence on Mars and are periodically terrorizing Earth from there. Of course, war with Mars would be a logistical nightmare, to say the least, without speed of light travel. But thankfully that technology exists. People can be broken apart, turned into light, and reassembled elsewhere in just the amount of time that it takes light to travel the distance in question. So essentially a beaming technology. Our protagonist and first-person narrator is a soldier who has signed up for military training for this war, and she is eager to prove herself worthy of citizenship and just eager to fight the evil assholes from Mars. But in time it turns out that she is one of a limited number of soldiers with whom this de-assemblage and reassemblage of their substance does something funny and timey-wimey. They become displaced in time, meaning that they experience events in a jumbled order, jumping back and forth in time, but keeping their memories. And that lets them hear and see things that make them see the war and their whole society in a different light and make them question the legitimacy of it all. I quite liked this concept. The execution I was not so sure about. For one, the writing style is very basic, and that makes sense. I'll give it that, because it was written from the perspective of an uneducated person, a soldier with a rather simplistic way to look at things and probably not a lyrical bone in her body. But it also made for a very dry read, and this is just simply not something that I enjoy. This is purely a personal thing, I'd say. The second source of frustration is a bit more objective, I'd say. It was that the book just hammers its very simple and basic message about capitalism and the ruler's control of reality and the narrative, you know, control the past, control the future, the present, I don't know. This very basic message was hammered in over and over again, sometimes even explicitly, because throughout the book there are interspersed the protocols of interviews that are conducted with our protagonist when she is at a late stage in the plan, arrested by the corporation leaders. And in those, she explains herself explicitly and explains why she has joined the rebellion of the soldiers of the Light Brigade and what's not okay with her society. And this was just so exasperating to me, because I got that from the very first paragraph, you know. So my overall verdict is that I liked the idea, but the execution kind of ruined it. And maybe I should have read about the Crimean War instead. My next read was a very slim ebook, if an ebook can be slim. Once Upon a Haunted Moor by Harper. This is a very short paranormal romance, or a murder mystery with paranormal elements and also a romance. You could also say it is romantic in both senses of the word. I'm counting it among the fantasy books because the paranormal elements are very strong. The romance is also very strong, and it is a steamy romance, so be warned. This is set on Bodmin Moor in Cornwall, where the police officer of a small village has been looking for a missing girl who vanished in the haunted moor for 2 weeks. The mother of the missing girl has become so desperate that she has called in a psychic. And the cop is understandably skeptic at first, but the psychic has credentials. He has in fact worked with the police before and with the cop's own boss. And he seems to be an earnest guy and not just out to exploit desperate and grieving people. So the two of them join forces and look for the missing girl together. This is the first book in a series of cases with paranormal elements that these two protagonists are then going to solve together. And I thought that this one had a very nice atmosphere, set as it was on the cold and bleak autumn moor, and with the supernatural threat of the Bodmin beast always lurking in the background. Unfortunately, the romance was not developed well, or at all. It was quite a bad case of insta-love, and the first protagonist, the policeman, goes from calling the psychic a charlatan and just wanting him out of his way, to coming out to the whole village for him in the space of a day. It was hard to take that seriously. However, I liked the atmosphere enough to be willing to give the second book in the series a chance. And that one is set during the Christmas time, so maybe sooner rather than later. As it happens, the non-fiction book that I'm reading at the moment is The Moor by William Atkins, and this one opens with a chapter on Bodmin Moor, and reading that has made me all the more eager to go back to that series. And Bodmin Moor is also the setting of Jamaica Inn by Daphne du Maurier. Jamaica Inn is an actual inn on Bodmin Moor that was made newly popular by Daphne du Maurier's book. And reading The Moor has also nudged this one up a few notches on my to-read list. And the last book that I'm going to talk about today is Call Down the Hawk by Maggie Stiefvater. This was published at the beginning of November, and it was one of my most anticipated reads of the year, which is why I went into it with some trepidation, but I needn't have worried. This is the first book in the Dreamer trilogy, which is a spin-off trilogy or sequel trilogy to The Raven Cycle by Maggie Stiefvater. And since it is a spin-off sequel, naturally, anything and everything that I could say about the story is going to contain spoilers for the Raven Cycle. So I'm going to put the word spoiler on the screen here, so that you can put your fingers in your ears while it's there, or so that you can jump ahead to the end of the spoiler tag. This is set after the events of the Raven King, and it is the story of Ronan Lynch, who is a dreamer like his late father. He can take things, including living things, out of his dreams into reality with him when he wakes up. He has always thought that after the death of his father, he is the only one of his kind. But as it turns out, he is one of a number of such dreamers worldwide, and in this story, he is on a trajectory to meet another one, Jordan Hennessy. Jordan has had for years and years a recurring dream in which a great and powerful evil is trying to force its way through the dreamers into our world. In the impending showdown and fight against that evil, Ronan and Jordan get guidance from a mysterious entity who is as yet merely a voice in Ronan's dreams. We, including the characters, also don't yet know the nature of this great and powerful evil. So this is still to be revealed in the later books. And as if all that weren't calamity enough, there also exists a band of zealots who are hunting down the dreamers because they think of them as abominations and threats to the world order. We don't yet know either the exact nature of this organization and who founded it and who commands it. So lots and lots of mysteries still, and incredibly high stakes, much higher than in the Raven Cycle. It seems like the world as we know it is at stake. Accordingly, the tone of this new trilogy is much more serious than that of the Raven Cycle. It is much darker, and the characters are fighting much grimmer and more disturbing demons. It feels much more adult than the Raven Cycle. I don't even know if I'd still call this young adult. The writing, which was already often quite quirky in the Raven Cycle, is even more idiosyncratic and lyrical in this one. It was almost too much so in places, but it always managed to stay just shy of too special snowflakey and trying too hard and being just eye-roll inducing. All in all, I thought that this was a very strong and very mature beginning to this new trilogy, and I can't wait to read the next one. And those were all the science fiction and fantasy books that I read in November. If you have read any of those books, as always, I would love to hear what you thought about them in the comments. Until the next video, bye!